Thanks, Mike. Can I invite my panelists up now? Borna Vrdoljak from Vertical Aerospace, David Sercombe from magniX, and Thomas Sweeney from Cirium. Thanks, guys. So let's start with some introductions. I'll go along the line, because you all come at the conversation today from very different perspectives. So it'd be great if you could share a little bit about what you and your companies are doing with respect to new aerospace technologies, particularly those that can benefit the helicopter industry.
Yeah, so mine's Thomas Sweeney. I work for Cirium Ascend Consultancy, mostly as an appraiser, but also working on consulting projects. So in this space, Cirium looks at sort of news and market updates, and we provide the market with that. But more recently, we've been getting into how can we appraise these assets? How can we look at value retention in the long term? And clearly, that's not as sort of much of a science as it would be. It's already an art and science for helicopters, but for this, it's sort of, we're looking at how can they generate revenue, what's the cost, and then taking a PV of that over time, what would someone be looking at paying for this in the market? So we've been doing kind of reports, mostly for OEMs, around that. So yeah, very interested to discuss more with my other panelists.
Fantastic. Firstly, thanks, Yves, for the opportunity and the after-lunch spot. Now, Thomas and Borna and I have promised not to be boring, but we've got a heavy lift. So my name's David Sercombe. I'm the VP of Engineering for magniX. magniX has been around for quite a while. I've been around since the beginning, longer than most of the furniture that we have. I was part of the team that developed the core technology that goes into our powertrain products. Our focus is very much on the powertrain. So we don't necessarily do the airframes, we don't necessarily look at that. You know, we're looking at the powertrain solution. Now, our primary focus has been the fixed-wing market with the Magni 350 and Magni 650 electric engines. And we have to call them electric engines because that's how they're going to get certified. So that's the nomenclature that we've got to use. So we've basically, the magniX's story is, 6 first flights over the last 6 years, on 6 different platforms, from retrofit, fixed wing, rotary wing, full battery electric, hydrogen, fuel cell, and a suite of different opportunities, basically with the same powertrain product. We're looking at that opportunity across a couple of different markets. Now, more recently, what we've done after a lot of testing, a lot of extensive, is we're bringing to the fore the Helistorm product, which is a helicopter-targeted powertrain product. It's higher speed, 6,000, 7,000 RPM, sort of more in the traditional turboshaft range. And we're really excited to see what electrification looks like what electrification opportunities look like in the conventional helicopter space and also in the emerging spaces, right, as we look at mobility more broadly. So yeah, that's the magniX piece.
Thanks. Borna Vrdoljak, so I'm head of product and customer marketing at Vertical Aerospace. Spent over 20 years at Airbus, and 3 years ago I had the exciting opportunity to join Vertical to pioneer electric aviation in the space of eVTOLs. Vertical Aerospace started in 2017, and recently we've started flying our second eVTOL prototype, piloted, and very, very excited about moving forwards to continue the development and our target to certify the aircraft. We're being more realistic. We are a startup, but very much an aerospace company. We have people from Rolls-Royce, Airbus, Leonardo, Bell, many established industries. We understand what it means to develop and certify a brand new aircraft with a completely new powertrain. So our target to certify is 2028. Without talking about it too much, I think it's better if we just watch a video of our piloted thrust-borne flight late last year.
Ready, set. Tango off.
Controllers go for takeoff.
TAC accelerating.
Continue.
Good, and decelerating now.
Plow on ground.
Test out. Good job, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thought, let's clear up one thing first for our helicopter audience. For clarity, is the intent to compete with traditional helicopters, create new markets altogether, or is it maybe a little mix of both?
Helicopters play a vital role with key mission-critical operations. We're starting a new industry. We're being realistic about what we can do. We don't believe we're competing. The helicopter partners that we have as customers understand that you can't do the same. But they're asking themselves the questions, if I had an aircraft with substantially lower operating costs, what new markets can we open? And that's where they're focusing.
Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think very much we see this as about an adjunct, to the industry. It's less about carving out a slice of the pie, but increasing the size of the pie overall. The goal, fundamentally, at least from our side, I think, and somewhat collectively, we have significant challenges facing us, in terms of aviation, in terms of the availability of fuels going into the future, in terms of the cost profiles of those things. So part of this solution space is looking at how we use technology to not only increase basically access to aviation in general, and I think some very exciting opportunities in terms of helicopters and electric helicopters, more electric helicopters, hybrid electric helicopters, things along those lines that are going to present interesting and compelling use cases that expand beyond where we are currently today. So it's very much a yes and.
For us, I think when we're looking at analyzing these new technologies, we need to have something to compare it to, and helicopters are the best comparison. So I think to say that they don't operate in the same market isn't entirely true, but I think I agree that it's really about sort of expanding that, especially if it's possible to decrease operating costs, and that opens new markets. But there's not any usages that are being pitched for these technologies which haven't been at some point, helicopters haven't fulfilled that. So I think it's a mix, as you say.
So both Vertical and magniX, you've diversified your technology development somewhat, particularly on the battery front. Could you share more about why you decided to do this and some of the potential benefits? Maybe Borna, you'd like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I couldn't be more excited to be part of Vertical and the eVTOL journey. We're starting with an aircraft which has capability to fly up to 100 statute miles. That's excluding reserves. And I brought some examples. This is the battery that we have in our aircraft. We're talking about an energy density of 242 watt-hours per kilogram. And we have thousands of these. In fact, they're spread in 8 battery packs. So we have 8 propellers, 8 battery packs. But this is just the start. You've never had an aircraft like this. Around 50% of the energy of the aircraft is used for the actual flying cruise mission. But already here, if I take another battery, this is called a P50. This has 10% more energy. If we put this battery in our aircraft, that gives you 10% more energy. That would give you 20% more range. Think about it. 20% more range by swapping a battery cell. It doesn't stop there. This is a P60. This has 20% more energy. And this is what is in development at the moment. If we look at the automotive industry, the types of batteries that they are talking about in the news has an energy density that's double what we are flying with. Now, those batteries are no good for us. We need power. That's the critical element. And this is, Yves, what is so exciting for me about eVTOLs. These aircraft will get better and better and better, not by big STCs. We're talking about relatively simple battery swaps. It's a huge qualification process. With our first battery, we've already tested this over 4 million hours worth of all sorts of tests, from characterization, 15-meter battery drop tests, thermal runaway tests. It's a new space, and it's extremely exciting.
Yeah, certainly. I think really, in terms of the powertrain solution, the battery elements are an enabling technology for the people that we're looking to the people that we're working with, and ultimately operators of these things. I mean, obviously, we know we're working with Harbour Air on the fixed wing side, and some other opportunities in the rotary wing side that will be discussed. But the battery technology and battery energy density is the first thing, right? You need a certain level of energy density to start doing useful missions, to start this inflection point towards electrification. So that was number one. Number two was really working with some interesting, a cell partner that had some very interesting technology related to, I think, a lot of the safety pieces and the operational pieces that go into that. So again, energy density, the magniX product development is targeting 300 watt-hours per kilogram at the module level, right? So packaged up and ready to go. The third piece of the puzzle, we've spent an awful lot of time and energy, obviously because we do motor controllers for the powertrain, in software, in development of embedded system software for aerospace, per DO178C and DO254, lifecycle development to DAL-A level. And when we, at the time, sort of went through the gamut of who's who in the zoo in the battery world, that was really, I think, a key element, right, of it's not just the technology and the packaging and the study itself, but also the lifecycle qualification of all of the fancy software that goes to control that. And that was something that I think we were able to parlay from another part of the business into it, and really to sort of provide a comprehensive solution to address the battery electric piece of the puzzle. Remembering that that has adjuncts into hybrid electric as well. You still require some battery, and the same thing even to further out with the hydrogen piece. And so to that end, I think it became sort of a logical move in the powertrain side.
One of the primary arguments for electrification is the reductions in direct operating costs. I wonder if you could explain to me a little bit about what factors are driving those savings.
Well, the key element is the reduction in fuel. I mean, it costs nothing, hardly, to charge these aircraft in comparison to fuel costs. And the second is maintenance. So for a light helicopter, what our customers have told us is typically for 1 hour of flying, they're spending 2 hours in maintenance. The biggest maintenance task on this aircraft is going to be changing the battery packs. If you're flying it intensively, we're talking around 1,000 hours a year. You're talking about once a year swapping out that pack. But the rest, it's sealed units, and of course we'll need to demonstrate through all the reliability testing that we can meet that and have the regulatory oversight. But they're very simple aircraft from a maintenance perspective. They are very advanced as well. These are complex aircraft. You've got a lot of effectors, you've got tilt, you've got motors, you've got movable surfaces, but still, it's a fully digital integrated aircraft.
Yeah, it's the DOC's piece is obviously, and look, it depends a little bit where you are in the world, what the drivers are, right behind. Obviously, we're a US-based company. I live in the US. A lot of the fundamental element is the economics around it, right? And for this to be a really serious, compelling offering, it has to have an economic benefit. People aren't just going to do it necessarily just because, or just to be green. Now, that's not necessarily true across the gamut of application spaces. The DOCs, I think, DOCs and how that parlays into total cost of ownership of the asset throughout its operating life cycle, I think is really important. We see it, there are certainly missions where there's a very compelling economic case, and we're starting to see some of that with the people we're working with and the emerging elements. It's not all missions at this particular point in time. And I think another thing that's fairly fair to say is while there are tremendous advantages, right, in fuel cost versus electricity cost, again, slightly predicated on where you are in the world, but up in Washington State, power's pretty cheap. You know, the Harbour Air, we're talking about some of their flights, you know, they're talking about $260 worth of avgas being reduced to $21 worth of electricity. That's not the full story, right, because you do have the battery cost, you have the aspects of that over its life cycle. These things are somewhat sensitive to the missions. They're somewhat sensitive to the assumptions that go into the life, to the validating those assumptions around the life. They're somewhat sensitive to things like second life of batteries and how much you sort of took to your value proposition element, right? And so, as an industry, you know, as someone developing batteries, right, we're very interested in the validation of each of those pieces of the puzzle. We believe that there's a compelling story here, but at the same time, you know, we have to move effectively and cautiously in order to be able to say, well, here's where the savings are and demonstrate that over time. And that I think is it's an interesting journey, but it's one that sort of everybody's on at the moment.
Yeah, Thomas, you.
Well, so
No, you go, Thomas.
okay.
Please.
So the analysis that we've done, sort of at the beginning of entry into service of a lot of these vehicles, definitely the fuel versus electricity savings are there, but the maintenance costs, I think, need some time to show themselves, whether in comparison to, say, an H125, there really is an advantage. We haven't seen a huge amount of evidence of that yet, but we're really interested to know if that will materialize on the long term as these sort of, I mean, you've got a head start of 25, 30 years on these helicopters in terms of making the maintenance schedules easier. So,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, look, I think in the early days of the VTOL business, there were some shocking numbers being talked about. What we do with our customers, so we have 12 customers, pre-orders for 1,500 aircraft, and it's not just about signing and then running away and saying, we'll come back when the aircraft's ready. We onboard them, we engage them regularly, we have an open book of our economics model. They have a copy of it. They're able to put in their assumptions, what they believe. We walk them through the maintenance process with our licensed engineers to make sure that we're being realistic, because we want to understand where we're great and where we need to be careful to make sure we meet the operating costs that they expect.
So what kind of real-world data is being collected to come up with these projections about operating costs?
Yeah, I think, so, you know, obviously, what is it? When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? When you're a powertrain supplier, everything is a motor problem in one form or another. You know, we spend a large amount of time testing, fundamentally, and validating each of the elements. magniX was the first company to be issued a special condition by the FAA for the certification of an electric engine under Part 33. And of course, that comes with it, you know, comes along basically a certification process that involves a large amount of testing, including that, you know, a lot of times you have to have all of your manuals ahead of time before you commence the testing so you can actually perform maintenance along the way. So it's a combination of getting hours on it, getting hours on the different applications. Now, obviously the helicopter world is very interesting for us because in some respects it's, you know, obviously has a very different set of constraints, has a very different set of operating parameters that's kind of interesting. In other respects, you know, you don't have the big prop hanging off the engine as much so more, so there's a different, you know, some slightly different challenges that I think exist in this world. But fundamentally, test is one key element on the technology side. On the operator side, you know, we commenced flying with Harbour Air in 2019. It was our first flight. It was a retrofitted de Havilland Dash 2 Beaver. That recently went through its 100th test flight over the years. So we've actually, you know, the engine has been back for maintenance during that time. That's not our battery system on that, but there were some very interesting findings along the way looking at the operational characteristics of the battery system and how that could be optimized as part of the total cost of ownership offering. And of course, from their perspective as an operator, you know, they are looking at something like 90% of the common routes they run, you know, commercially, being able to be serviced by an electric offering, which is pretty interesting niche when it comes to starting things out from that perspective. And I think now, everybody's saying, well, that's great in fixed wing, but what about the rest of us in the rotary wing world? And we've had some demonstrators with electrified helicopters that have been done. We had one a couple of years back, fully electric. Just recently with Proticity, very interesting application, last mile organ delivery, very capable team, very interesting team. They just did a hydrogen fuel cell, fully electric, but with a hydrogen fuel cell. A very, very interesting application from that perspective. But again, they're starting to get out and fly missions, fly direct spaces, gather data, make sure that, essentially what we put on paper matches some form of reality and then go back and go through. But there's still a journey, one that we're quite happy to be a part of. But that's really when the proof is going to be in the pudding.
Would anyone else like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the operating cost of the aircraft, the biggest part, no surprise, is the ownership cost. So the lease, the financing. Thomas, it would be interesting to hear your views on that. One of our largest customers is Avalon, world's second largest aircraft leasing company. So we're getting good insights there as to what kind of lease rates we could expect. The second big part, it's the crew, the training. So we know how much pilots cost. We're not expecting to pay them less. We have a partnership with CAE, so we know what the training courseware program and duration will be. So that part is well understood, I think. The third part, again, roughly 20%, it's the battery replacement costs. Now, we know how much the cells cost, and we are developing, certifying, and producing the battery packs. So that cost internally is well understood, and I think it has more room for optimization as we scale. And then the last part, well, that's the landing fees. Similar to a helicopter, I think we're all hoping that as we scale, those can come down because they're quite high for helicopters, where we understand that. And then you have the maintenance, which is very, very little in comparison to the value of the battery swaps. So broadly speaking, we've got a very good understanding, and that's the feedback we're getting from our customers.
I think there's also room for the OEMs to take some of the risk in PBH agreements for the maintenance. That's something that is quite an important assumption in our model, is whether there will be that certainty for the operator on maintenance costs by way of a PBH agreement.
So how do you think helicopter financing models may evolve when we get to the point when buyers are essentially paying part of their fuel costs, i.e. the batteries up front?
It's not exactly how we've been looking at it, because we've been thinking about the battery costs more as a maintenance portion than sort of an ownership piece. It's not equivalent to, but it's most similar to the engine in a helicopter. So there's definitely that when we're looking at how much a customer would be willing to pay for these aircraft, factoring in those maintenance costs and, as I said, maybe potentially PBH on the batteries, that will sort of then play into the cost versus revenue assumptions that we look at. But yeah, I don't think of it as sort of paying up front in that way as much.
So you sort of treat it more as like an engine reserve, basically, sort of like, right.
Yeah, I think a lot of misconceptions about eVTOLs, people compare it to an electric car. When you buy an electric car, the battery is half of the value of the vehicle. Now, with an eVTOL, it's single-digit percentage values of the overall aircraft. It's substantially lower. If you look inside the battery, the cells, that's roughly a third of that value. So it's significantly less, but it will take us a lot of time, energy, value and effort to certify those batteries, especially to European EASA's safety standards. So a lot of it is in terms of IP value, not necessarily the cells. Yeah? And just to mention this cell, There's no secrets. It's a Taiwanese cell, Molicel P45B. You type this into Google, you can order this battery and get it delivered at home. Okay? We're not preying on some new battery technology which may or may not arrive in the future. It's known technology.
Yeah, I think the point is perhaps, thinking of an engine reserve is not a bad way of thinking of it. Someone's going to have to pay for it, right? And I think given the dialogue in this sphere today, we're talking about leasing arrangements, talking about financing arrangements, where money's coming from. I think there's still quite a long conversation to have about what, with these emerging technologies, that's going to evolve towards. Because there is an element of, in some respects, whether it's a maintenance reserve, whether it's an initial, higher OE cost, whether it's being treated in the same way afterwards. At the moment, one of the interesting things about sort of traditional engine models is, okay, you're making a little bit of money off the engine, or maybe not making too much money off the engine, or depending on which OEM. And then there is a significant revenue stream from the maintenance piece of the puzzle. So that still represents something that is part of the established method. New technology gives an opportunity for us to rethink some of those things, but there's also an element of like, okay, what do you do in terms of who gets what and when in the value chain when you're replacing one of the significant streams in the maintenance side. So again, a lot of this I think is just opportunities to kind of think out, especially if you're looking holistically in terms of second life and alternate lives for battery technology, things like that. There's some very interesting, I think, financial attributes to consider. But also, I think if we're looking at bringing products to market that ultimately have a compelling economic case, and there is an effect on total cost of ownership and direct operating costs, how do we as an industry think about ways in which we can enable operators to gain access to those costs, right? If the barrier is if the initial cost ends up being a barrier, right? And that's a big if, right? But I think we're looking at sliding dimensions in this various element, and now is probably a good time to have the conversation about what the future financing models and arrangement look like as the technology emerges. Especially, I think when we're talking about maybe more of the traditional helicopter market, more along the lines of retrofits, something that looks a little bit more akin to what we see today, realizing that the future will come where that's slightly different.
I think when you look at financing, one big challenge is this technology, this first initial round of products, going to become obsolete very soon? How will things move forward? And that's where vertical, we're not rushing with a minimum viable product. We need to be very careful there. It's not a flying taxi. This is an aircraft we're trying to develop and sell. And an aircraft is an asset that needs to be financed. And if you want good financing rates, you'll need to show that it's an aircraft that's going to be around in many years to come. This is why at Vertical we're designing an aircraft which will enter into service as a four-seater, but it's larger than the other eVTOLs. We'll have a higher max takeoff weight, and we will have the room, the volume, that as batteries get better, not only could you fly further, but instead you could trade the range, put in fewer cells, free up payload, and you can add a fifth seat, and later you can add a sixth seat. And what about bags? Well, our cargo hold, we believe, is one of the leading in terms of capacity. We want this aircraft to have room to grow as the battery technology evolves and develops. And we're hoping with that the appraisers, the financiers will have confidence to offer our operators attractive lease rates, because that, I think, is one of the biggest costs and the most challenging ones, especially what's the future of the asset.
Yeah, that upgradability of batteries is key. We don't see, if you were creating an eVTOL where it was specific to that battery type, we would see the useful economic of that life of that aircraft being quite low. So for the reports we've done, we've kind of looked at a range of useful economic life assumptions, sort of the lowest being 15, highest maybe being 25 for the rotary kind. but that is all predicated on being able, once new battery technology comes in, being able to easily put that in and with as much difficulty as it might be retrofitting a new engine in a helicopter, for example.
So we're running a little short on time, but there's a few more questions I want to get through here, particularly moving to certification, because I think this is particularly interesting for our audience. Certifying in Europe means vertical is held to a higher safety standard than in the US, for example. Can you elaborate on the advantages of stricter safety standards and perhaps the increased usable range in European countries?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. So there's a lot of debate about EASA and the FAA aligning. Yeah, of course, we'd love to see that. What you don't hear very often is what standards they're trying to align to, because the standard we need to reach is SC-VTOL category enhanced. That's what you need to fly commercially in urban areas. EASA also has a second standard, which is called SC-VTOL category basic. And that's the standard which we believe is far more closely aligned with the FAA. The problem with that standard, Yves, is you can't fly commercially in urban areas. You can't do an air taxi with that. So for the moment, it looks like we're on our own in terms of being an OEM that's looking to certify to open up commercial operations in Europe. That certification, what about operating rules? So last year, the FAA introduced SFAR. It was tough, but they came out with the rule that eVTOLs will need to have 20 minutes of flight reserves. That's roughly 20 statute miles of reserves. That's tough, yeah? As soon as you take off, and you need to have that for safety. In Europe, EASA's approach is somewhat different. And with the higher safety standard, in fact, the amount of reserves we would need to carry would be about half of that. So you've got up to 33% more usable range on our aircraft when you fly in Europe compared to the US. Not a lot of people know that, and that's why Europe is a great use case for eVTOLs.
That's a great question on a landmine, because I live in the US, so thank you very much, Yves.
No worries.
Look, I think, let me try and answer, let me try and answer in a circumspect way as possible. I think, what we see in both, what I see in both sides of the pond is the regulators have a fundamental responsibility, and that is firstly to the flying public. Right, and as a member of the flying public, I'm quite grateful for that, whatever my other thoughts might be. I mean, what I would see in both sides is, you have a group of dedicated people who are moving forward. I think the harmonization efforts are really important, and I think that there are groups within both the EASA and the FAA, and more broadly, ANAC and TCCA, that are working together to harmonize on a bunch of these rules. Obviously we'd be more interested in the more powertrain-specific ones, but fundamentally, these are the two biggest markets, and there needs to be cross-validation means in order for any technology, really, I think, to have a good showing. So these, where there are differences, yes, there are nuances, and that's important to consider. But at the same time, I think the efforts that are ongoing around harmonization, around achieving similar standards and similar outcomes from a safety perspective, are key. And as participants in this, we don't make the rules. We do not influence the rules. We simply have a responsibility to engage with the standards committees, engage with the industry bodies, provide data where we can in order to support that, so that we are making data-driven decisions based on testing when it comes to the next generation of regulations. And provided we continue to do that, I think there's a path towards reasonable harmonization, hopefully across both regulators and beyond.
Thanks, David.
I think also engaging with sort of local governments is important as well, because you can get certification, but there's also going to be a whole bunch of myriad of different opinions from local and regional players. So I think for this industry to take off, it's really important that that gets the focus as well.
Okay, so we're running short on time, so could we get Slido up on there for some interactive questions from the audience? My apologies to David and Thomas, they're virtually all for Borna.
Okay, no worries. I'll just sit here and comment.
So this first one, in your video, we only see vertical lift. Has the transition flight been tested?
Almost. So last week, we flew our first piloted wing-borne flight. So we took off conventionally from a runway rolling takeoff. And tomorrow, our head of strategy, Michael Cervenka, he'll be talking and he'll show you the video of our wing-borne flight. Transition is targeted for the second half of this year.
So the next question, we didn't actually mention this, but obviously you recently announced your hybrid variant.
Electric is still our core product. As we've seen, defense focus has increased recently, and this is a natural opportunity to engage in defense markets, which frankly need a lot more range than for urban operations. Our core product is still very much the electric version, and as I showed you with the batteries, there's huge potential for these aircraft to continue to grow in terms of capability.
And here's the one question that maybe we can all have a go at answering. How many of the pre-orders are actually orders rather than an LOI or an MOU?
Yeah. So the majority are MOUs. We do have some pre-delivery payments, and all of that information is public in our filings.
Oh, I got the chance. So I think the public ones are LOIs with Harbour Air. Beyond that, we're very much privately owned, and so the beyond that is unfortunately not for public discussion. But
I mean, we classify everything as sort of LOI/orders in our database. Obviously, we know that there are some firmer orders than others, but we can't kind of go through the classification of where on that range they are as in detail as for current technology.
Yeah, okay. I'm kind of interested to know, do you guys see a point in time where firm orders backed by pre-delivery payments will become a significant part of your revenue income?
I hope so. Yeah, of course. But we need to go through to transition. We need to firm up the design. We do have iterations on our aircraft design by engaging our customers. And with guarantees, we will be asking for more of them to make pre-delivery payments, because in aerospace, that's how we fund our development until we can deliver. Yes.
Okay, couple more. Yeah. Oh, sorry, if you
jump in. No, that's all right. I just think it's a little more complicated because we're sort of on the powertrain side. So, I think there is a little bit of, if you're sort of talking about pre-cert versus post-cert deliveries, I mean, fundamentally, we're already supplying into a number of different programs, some of which are public, some of which are not. We would see magniX, and some of which you wouldn't necessarily there in order to support demonstrators and in order to support other people's paths to certification while we're on our own. I think that the primary inflection point is that TC, right? Is the engine TC, and then being able to deliver into certified platforms.
One for you, Thomas.
Yeah, so the methodology we've been using has been more on an ad hoc basis. You're not going to find values for these things online as you would for helicopters, but what we've really been looking at is comparing the revenue generating potential in various use cases at different utilization ranges to the cost, and then we've sort of looked at the profit that an operator might be able to make over a certain economic life, as I mentioned earlier, 15, 20, 25 years, and then taken a present value of that, and then taken a percentage of that based on the sharing of profit between OEM and operator. So that's kind of the basis of the model that we use, and then we iteratively bring back in the ownership costs into the cost model. So if anyone's more interested in kind of learning about our model and everything, I'm very happy to have a conversation, but yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. And thank you, guys. It's been a great panel, and unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could talk about this all day, but thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Yves.